Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute or two for everyone to get situated.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I can't get this lighting situation going. Either way, I look a little yellow.
The light bulb is probably yellow.
I should go in my room. I'm going to my room where the lighting is perfect. How do you do a fake background?
Let's see. It should be in your settings.
Excuse me. You go into, you click on the little, you click on your start video icon and there's a little like arrow and it'll open up a drop box that says choose virtual background. You see it?
I sure do see it.
No, but it looks better with me standing up, so I guess I'm standing up.
So am I.
That works. Even though I'm hot. I mean, well, are we ready?
Yes, I certainly am. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to our audience here on the Zoom call and those who are tuned in via Facebook Live. Welcome to our second public hearing for the Community Development Block Grant Mitigation Action Plan. We'll be discussing what we have proposed. We are in the midst of the public comment period. I'm going to go ahead and mute some folk here. Gotcha. Yes, so we're in the midst of a public comment period. It ends on December 22nd. And I'll give you a little bit more information as we move forward. So today our presenters are myself, the communications manager here at VI Housing Finance Authority. Also, we'll have Mr. David Martin, our Chief Disaster Recovery Officer, Mrs. Antoinette Fleming, who is the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Director, and Mr. Andrew Thorley of Tetra Tech, who's a Project Manager for Mitigation. And before we move forward, I'll have our Executive Director, Mr. Darrell Griffith, bring some opening remarks. Mr. Griffith?
Good day, everyone, and thank you for taking time out to attend this meeting today on the Community Development Block Grant Mitigation. I am Darrell Griffith, the Executive Director of the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority. This is so important that you're here to give your input, because this is going to directly dictate how we spend $774 million of these mitigation funds. And your input is critical for the final output of this action plan, in which we're going to say which programs we're going to fund and which we're going to say which sectors we're funding. So thank you for coming out here today. This is really, for us, one of the most important aspects, because it lets us know that if we're going into the right direction for the destination of mitigating the projects in the Virgin Islands. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. I ask for not only questions tonight, but also statements too as well. If you don't have a question and you'd like to make a statement saying that this is a project I think you should fund, this is a sector I think you should be funding, that's very critical information for us, so that to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. Thank you, and Ms. Miller, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. So first, I'd like to inform you guys of where to find the MIT action plan. So if you go onto our website, it's cdbgdr.vihfa.gov. This is a actual image of what the website looks like. And if you click on learn more on the right-hand corner of the page, it will take you to the mitigation landing page, where the action plan is published in English and in Spanish. And this presentation that we're doing tonight is also on the website for you to review. There's also some more information about mitigation throughout the entire page, and you can feel free to look through that, read through all of the literature there for more information. So the goals for today's public hearing are: one, to gather feedback and comments while presenting the published action plan. And that's really why we're here. We want to get all of your feedback. We want to know if we are on the right track with mitigation. And because these funds will directly benefit you, the public and residents of the Virgin Islands, we need your input. You are the direct stakeholders of these funding programs. We also want to discuss the planned project areas that will help save lives and reduce future losses to homes, businesses, and critical facilities. So mitigation is designed to be proactive, so we can mitigate against future hazards. We also want you guys to spread the word about the comment process and the available online survey. We encourage feedback from you guys. So also on the mitigation landing page on the website, there's a survey that we would like for you to take, and it discusses what the priority or areas that you feel we should focus on when responding to a disaster and to prepare for one. So those are the goals for today's public hearing. So this is a process for us to gather your feedback. We encourage verbal comments at the end of the presentation. We would like for you to use the chat feature. I think that will do a better job at recording what your questions and feedback are. And when you do that, please state your name, the organization that you are associated with, if any, and then state your questions. If you want to do it verbally, that's welcome as well. So when the presentation is open at the end, it's limited to 4 minutes per person, and we will take all comments and questions then. Like I mentioned before, please take the mitigation survey if you have time. The links are right there. I'll ask maybe Brenna if you can drop the link to the survey in the chat, please and thank you. And if you're not comfortable stating your questions or comments on the live on this meeting here tonight, or maybe you need a little bit more time to read through the material and to think about what you want to say, you're most welcome to email your feedback and comments to mitigation@vihfa.gov. And it's all here on the screen. And now I will bring on Mr. David Martin, who will talk a little bit more about what MIT funding is. And I will get back to you guys at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Keela. A couple points about MIT funding. Number one, as Executive Director Griffith mentioned earlier, the territory has been allocated over $774 million for mitigation and resilience. And at the bottom of this slide, the territory has received an extension so that it has adequate time to address citizen participation and other regulatory requirements. And the additional extension is until January 4th, 2021, and obviously that's due to COVID. Thank you. One thing that you probably hear about, and just in case you don't have a good definition, we use the word tranches, and essentially they're funding allocations released by HUD. The focus of this evening is Tranche 3, which is, again, mitigation. And HUD provides community development block grants for disaster recovery. And again, tonight we're going to focus on Tranche 3 for mitigation. And in the following slides, we will learn more about mitigation's different programs and participation requirements. By definition, mitigation are those activities that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to, and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. So what are the goals for CDBG MIT? One, to support data-informed investments and focus on repetitive loss of property and critical infrastructure. Two, to build capacity to comprehensively analyze disaster risk and update hazard mitigation plans. Three, to support the adoption of policies that reflect local and regional priorities with a focus on community risk reduction. And then finally, maximizing the impact of funds by leveraging private and public partnerships and communication with other federal sources. The final thing I just want to mention to you is the spending timeline. As the last bullet just says, 100% of the funds will be expended in 12 years. So if you do some math, this program will be engaging the territory into the 2030s. So now I'd like to transition to Director Antoinette Fleming.
All right, thank you, Mr. Martin. My responsibility right now is to share with you some information on CDBG activity requirements. Therefore, basic requirements are any activity we fund will follow, and here are the four in particular. You've heard one, the mitigation definition that was given to you by Mr. Martin. Any activity that we fund must meet that definition of mitigation. The next thing that we're going to look at when we fund an activity is it must address a current or future risk identified in the mitigation needs assessment. And I'll tell you more about the mitigation needs assessment in the next slide. The third thing we're going to look at out of the activity is it must be a CDBG eligible activity or eligible pursuant to the waiver or alternative requirements under the basic CDBG requirements. And the last thing we're going to look at when we fund an activity on the MIT is that the project must meet a HUD national objective. So the mitigation needs assessment, at this juncture in the whole process, we look at the risk based on the assessment, and we look at the action plan, and we also look at talking to our federal partners, the people like Public Works, our consultants, people that work in the private sector, government agencies. We first consult with them about what is the mitigation needs for the territory. We also examine the most recent risk assessment via the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Plan. And we also examine and identified risks in the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Plan. We look at these three things and we come up with a document on the next slide that says we rank them based on the assessment. So going on to the next slide, we identified the risk by these by these activities or these hazards listed in this Excel document. So under hazard, we have drought, earthquake, riverine flooding, coastal flooding, hurricane, pandemic or disease outbreak, rain including landslide, tsunami, and wildfire. So for the mitigation needs assessment section within the mitigation action plan, hazards are ranked by the potential dollar loss as it reflects in the table, what I've just talked about, which shows an updated risk assessment ranking for the territory. Now, this ranking arose from the careful analysis of the currently available data that we mentioned in the previous slide. Now, based on these identified hazards, hurricane and riverine flooding are the two top ranked hazards that we have come up with. Note that riverine flooding results from heavy rainfall causing water runoff that spills onto adjacent lower lying areas and this is contrast to coastal flooding, which is considered a separate risk. So the riverine flooding is very genuine to the territory because we have a lot of high line areas in the hills with St. Thomas and St. John and even St. Croix, and when the rain comes down, it tends to flood the lower line areas or the adjacent property line. So these are things that affect us in disasters and impact our recovery. Moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about the risk analysis. So the mitigation needs assessment section was developed using data for the 2019 Territorial Hazard Mitigation Plan. As a result of the ongoing pandemic, we continue to meet with stakeholders and we have increased the data from that discussion. Potential threats and risks have been analyzed. We examine mitigation measures that may have reduced potential risks to residents in the territory. We also investigate priorities. We project selections and propose programs aligning in the mitigation needs assessment with selected activities outlined in the action plan. Now, there will be significant overlap with existing territorial priorities. We recognize that. The assessment of the data from the community needs and the CDBG eligible activities, especially when we factor in the community lifelines that I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So these that you see before you, these are called the lifelines, FEMA lifelines. And anything that we are looked to addressing in the mitigation action plan must seek to serve or address one of these type of activities, whether it is safety and security, food, water, and shelter, or the project may seek to address a health or medical situation, energy, communication, or a transportation issue in the territory, or maybe it's a hazardous material type of activity. So these are the critical service areas, or we call them lifelines. And we're looking at the projects that we fund impact one or more of any of these activities. So moving on to the mitigation national objective, similar to CDBG and CDBGDR, we follow the basic CDBG principles. We must demonstrate that the ability to operate for the useful life of the project and include a plan for the long-term operation and maintenance of the infrastructure or the public facility. In other words, if we seek to use MIT funds for a public facility, included in the program budget must be ways and means for you to have maintained and operated and maintain the building for the use of the building. The second thing is we must be consistent with the other mitigation activities that will be carried out. And of course, the most important thing is serving low to moderate income individuals. So benefits vulnerable population, especially the low income people in the community. In the action plan, I think it was mentioned before in the presentation, the MIT funds, at least 50% of the funds must benefit low to moderate income individuals. This is a drop from the initial DR funding, which required a 70% benefit to low to moderate income individuals. Also, under the national objective requirement, we're allowed to fund projects that serve the urgent need benefit. And in this category, the project addresses the current and future risks identified in the mitigation needs assessment. And the second thing is the result is measurable and verifiable reduction in risk of loss of life and property. So the last one I'm going to talk about for tonight is I talked about what was eligible, now ineligible. One of the things, there are four things mainly: funding for a building used for the general conduct of government. The second thing is emergency response services. So we're not prohibited, we're not allowed to fund projects that serve emergency response services. The next thing is assistance to private utilities. The fourth thing is the electrical grid projects. Now, of course, it would not be right of us to have a mitigation activity action plan if it did not address the electric energy, which energy is one of the lifelines. However, in the Federal Register notice, HUD prohibited the territory from addressing electrical projects until the Federal Register notice for the electrical grid funding, which is tranche 4 or allocation number 4, is written and shared with the territory and published. So until that is published, we cannot fund any activity that serve this type of activity. Once that is published and we are aware of the requirements, we will then come back to the public with any electrical activities if it's feasibly possible. So with what I've said so far, I will turn the conversation over to Andrew, and he will give you more information about the proposed activities.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Fleming. It's good to be with you. Remember that our goal this evening is to present the structure of the draft CDBG action plan so that we can solicit comments from you, the public, and get your feedback related to the potential funding opportunities. I'd like to start tonight by talking a little bit about some of the funding areas, which must be linked to strategic and high impact activities, right? We want to be able to look ahead at future disasters and look at ways that we can plan in advance for those disasters to mitigate or lessen or maybe even eliminate some of those risks or losses in the future. And we're going to specifically tonight talk a little bit about how those funds are currently allocated for infrastructure projects, for housing projects, economic revitalization, and also for planning and public services. And I'll spend some time going over each of those categories and talking about how those monies are allocated. Next slide, please. Much of the mitigation action plan is actually what we call a mitigation needs assessment. So there are several components of the plan. We need to make sure, as outlined here, that any activities that are selected are directly connected to a potential risk that's been defined by the data that we have within the territory. As a preliminary issue, however, the benefit of those projects has to be for those who are what we consider low and moderate income individuals. And that is a determination that is made based on available data within the territory. So we factor in who benefits from the project, what risks are being mitigated, and then we look as well at the community lifelines that Antoinette has defined for us. They're a FEMA term that talk about what the most high priority issues are following a disaster. Then we also look at cost benefit. Is the price of what the project is going to be a fit for what the cost is over the life of the project? Will there be enough monies for that particular project for maintenance, for example? And then what capacity exists on island within the territory to be able to implement projects? And as I said, there has to be maintenance built into the plan as well. So all of those considerations are part of the selection process when we look at what projects may work as a good mitigation project. Next slide, please. So let me walk through how the projects are currently allocated by activity. As you can see, this is within the action plan so that we can see the allocations. The vast majority, slightly over 50 at 54%, are currently set up for infrastructure and public facilities activities. And those would include both community resilience and public facilities to the tune of $102 million, and resilient critical and natural infrastructure for $315+ million, for a total allocation of $418 million, as you can see here on the slide. The next area for activities will be economic resilience and revitalization. We live in a world now in the territory where we have to deal with COVID-19. And so part of our planning also takes into account that reality. And we've built that into the mitigation needs assessment, as many of you will have seen within the action plan. So within economic resilience and revitalization, we have both commercial hardening and financing, which is at $40 million, and small business mitigation, which is at $36 million about, for a total of 76, almost $77 million, or 10% of the total amount that is to be allocated. The next segment is for housing at 25%, and that includes multifamily, also new ownership and construction options, which is vital for the territory. And of course, a homeless housing initiative. We think that there are dramatic things that can be done for homeless, which would help prepare for future disasters, as well as an innovative resilient housing program that's been proposed to be prepared in advance of disasters so that there are options available for housing on a temporary basis after a storm. There's also monies that have been allocated for public services at 2% or $15 million for planning, because a big part of planning for the future involves planning and studies. And so that's at 4% or $32 million. Administration is at 5%, as there is a lot of manpower that is required in order to execute on these plans and projects, which gets us to a total of the 774,188 that was talked about earlier by Ms. Fleming and Mr. Martin. Next slide, please. I want to start by talking a little bit about infrastructure and public facilities. It's essential that we have adequate community infrastructure and permanent emergency shelters. Those are not the only type of facilities, obviously, that would be covered here, but we need to be in a position to be ready for emergency situations. So having hardened and upgrading infrastructure is essential. Next slide, please. So as you can see within the action plan, the goal here is to be able to improve the facilities that serve the health and safety of the community. We want to make sure that resilience and mitigation measures are appropriate, that they fit well with what the territory needs, and that we're in a position to be able to deal with some of the risks that come from hurricane, from flood, and from the other identified risks, so that we might be able to lessen through these activities, through this funding, the potential impact in the future. Next slide. The second aspect of infrastructure and public facilities is some examples of potential projects that I want to talk about. There are many projects that have been presented and discussed within the territory from DPW, the Department of Public Works, along with assistance from FEMA and other US government agencies. There are funding available to do various things. We're also very focused on potentially improving the infrastructure at the landfills. After the storm, there was an immense amount of debris that was contributed to adding into those landfills. And we have to be able to have the ability to be ready for future debris and future disasters because of the amount of waste that is caused by a hurricane or by flooding, so that we can be making sure that the territories are in a good position to deal with that in the future. Next slide, please. So as part of this plan, the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority will be developing policies and procedures to make sure that all of the requirements for project eligibility are outlined in a clear way. There will be applications, as there are more projects currently identified than there are funding opportunities here. If funds allow for additional projects that are not identified as a priority issue within the action plan, they'll be ranked and scored. in accordance with established procedures, looking at the risks, looking also at how they fit within community lifelines, and how the factors that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation will be considered in deciding what the priorities are. Part of the reason that we're here tonight, as I said before, is to get community input. We're interested in what the community thinks, and that will be accounted for as well in establishing priorities for the activities and ultimate projects that are pursued here. Next slide. So one thing to keep in mind is if there are infrastructure projects or other projects for that matter, where the total project cost will be greater than 50 million or more, with at least 25 million coming from CDBG funding. It doesn't matter what the source is, whether it's disaster recovery or mitigation. Those projects require an additional analysis that we call benefit cost analysis, where we look at how funds will be spent, what the resulting benefits will be, and whether the amount of investment in those funds means that the project has merit. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot on a big project and not get much out of it. And so HUD is very focused on us making sure that we have good return on the investment, so to speak, by doing that type of benefit cost analysis. So for larger projects, that will have to be a factor in the equation as we look at what can be done with these funds moving forward. Next slide, please. I would like to now switch over to the next area, which is economic revitalization, for an allocation of almost 77 million, or 10% of the total amount. So this is a crucial component for long-term resilience within the territory. We need to be able to have economic resilience. We need to have viable options for people to have jobs and have the ability to support themselves. And so in this challenging period with COVID-19 making all of our lives different, it makes sense for us to also make sure that there is funding considered for ways to make that aspect of life in the territories better. Next slide, please. Within the action plan, there are two primary programs that have been defined. And of course, as with the other area that we just discussed, there is flexibility built into the plan, and there is competition built into the plan. The two major planned activities within economic resilience and revitalization are commercial hardening and financing, with an allocation of 40 million, and also small business mitigation with an allocation of 35 million. And these projects will require applications. And then the projects will be ranked and scored with in accordance with VIHFA criteria and the established policies and procedures. You'll notice here that these two aspects of economic revitalization are linked to specific community lifelines. All projects that are undertaken here will need to link back to the identified risks and or to the community lifelines for us to be able to show to HUD that these are viable projects that help with resilience and future plans. Next slide. So within the action plan, as you can see here, sometimes there is space within the action plan in economic revitalization for public-private partnerships. Commercial financing may be part of what these projects end up being, because the idea of CDBG mitigation funding is to be able to take advantage and magnify existing funds, working in conjunction with options to make those funds go even further. So leveraging those funds is a very high priority for HUD, and hence is part of the CDBG MIT action plan. We want to make sure that more than just CDBG MIT funds are being used and being applied here in the territory. Sometimes pairing CDBG MIT funds with private funding or other government funds can make those projects go even further. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that. Next slide. So within small business mitigation, there have been, within the action plan, there are several factors or priorities that have been defined that will be important as the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority looks at what projects and activities will be funded, right? Ideally, those selected activities will create jobs for predominantly low and moderate income individuals. They'll reduce the risk to life, property, and critical environments, remove hazardous materials, harden infrastructure. These are all identified factors that will be part of what will be part of the selection criteria that are used. They are not the only ones, but these are the ones that are currently in the draft action plan as we look at small business mitigation and make selections about what the best and highest use of those HUD funds will be. Next slide. The next area of funding will be housing. So housing is allocated currently at 25% for a total allocation of almost $193 million. We know that in the territory, there is a shortage of housing. There have been clear studies shown that that is a priority for many folks in the island. And the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority is committed to looking at projects that will help to prevent future housing problems. And so within housing, there are funds that are currently allocated for multifamily projects, also a new home ownership construction allocation for 61, almost $62 million. There are funds set aside for homeless housing, and also the innovative resilient housing that I mentioned earlier, so that there are options that are prepared and ready in advance of disasters. Housing, of course, is a key part of the VIHFA's mission, and it makes sense that additional housing would complement projects that are already anticipated under CDBG disaster recovery, which is ongoing as well, but is a separate allocation from the mitigation funding that we're talking about tonight. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are several different types of planned housing activities that are currently defined within the action plan. Some of it involves mitigating by way of rehabilitation, or reconstruction of owner-occupied or rental units, improving affordability of the rental stock. Other goals are restoring and making more resilient the current inventory of housing that exists. And very much a key part of this whole plan is to give priority to the most vulnerable in the Virgin Islands. So you'll see here within the chart, again, that there is a clear connection within this area, to the food, water, and shelter and community lifeline. It's a key component that all projects and all activities must be linked back to the established mitigation needs. There must be a risk or a concern that is linked to each project. Next slide, please. So I'd like to next talk briefly about planning and public services. There are many local, regional, and territory-wide uses of public services. Nonprofits and government entities alike can do a lot to benefit the public. And so we may look at improved building codes, zoning ordinances, or neighborhood plans. Those are all very common areas that HUD has identified as good ones for planning and public services. And we have funding in the amount of 15 million for public services, and then an additional 32, almost 33 if you round up, for planning, to make sure that the activities that are contemplated within MIT, within this action plan, and also in future decision making, will have good, solid data behind it. Next slide, please. So I talked briefly about planning. So I think what has been clear from the work that the VHFA has been doing over the last several months in gathering information and in looking at the risks within the territory is that a lot of good planning has been done, and a lot of planning is ongoing. However, when you're looking at future disasters and future risks, you can never be done with the planning. There are always new contingencies and new ideas or surprises that may arise. None of us back last year at this time anticipated that we would be as impacted by COVID-19. That's the nature of risk planning, is sometimes even with all of the opportunities that you already know about and all of the things that already grab your attention, additional things come up and new things arise. And sometimes through careful planning, you can identify what some of those risks are in advance and plan ahead so that you're prepared to act on them, much as has been done throughout the world this year in reacting to COVID-19, for example. That planning budget of almost $30 million can go a long way to improve looking ahead at future risks for the territory. Next slide, please. So I don't want to overlook the impact that nonprofits and public services have in the lives of many Virgin Islanders. I think it's critical that we keep in mind that people benefit a great deal from the type of work that is done through social services organizations and others to make life here a better quality, so to speak. So the mitigation needs assessment reveals a need for direct services to the community. And for that reason, this allocation of $15 million has been set aside. Next slide. As it says there in the action plan, I think this is an important quote, so I'm going to read it. The 2017 disasters exacerbated situations for already vulnerable populations. Within this group, the share of unemployment is high, resulting in a wide range of social services and subsidies required for these individuals and households. The occurrence of 2 back-to-back Category 5 storms and the displacement and chaos that followed has also increased the need for supportive services for vulnerable populations. Many people will benefit from the public service provisions that are here under MIT, and we hope that we'll see great projects and proposals to take advantage of this funding as well. Next slide. So whenever one administers a program of this size, it is necessary to allocate funding for support, the administrative side of things. Housing and urban development requires a certain number of employees, for example, to be able to handle the important critical compliance and support to make sure that the funds are accounted for, that procurement is done properly, that the people working hard to make sure that plans are implemented and carried out are receiving compensation. There's a lot of people that are required for the implementation of this type of funding on this level. And as Mr. Martin mentioned early on, it is essential that we remember that this is a long-term process. The administration will take time, and HUD understands that. The VIHFA would like to get as many things done as quickly as possible. They're about accomplishing things, but it will take time and many people to bring those things to fruition. At times, the administrative budget can be higher than 5%. I've seen that in the state of Texas, for example, and in other places. But here, the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority is towing the line and keeping it at 5%, which is almost still $39 million. And that will be important in bringing these projects to fruition. Next slide. So within those administrative activities, as I briefly mentioned, 5% will go a long way to make sure that project delivery happens, that subrecipients are receiving the guidance that they need, that program guidelines and policies are being followed. It has to be administered in a very orderly and consistent and detailed manner. And that requires oversight. It requires time. It requires a lot of professionalism. And administration is a key component in getting things accomplished within this action plan. Thank you. Next slide. So just to review, we are on a timeline for CDBG mitigation. And as you can see looking along here, excuse me, we're in the point here where we are responding to and incorporating public comments. The action plan has been available in a draft format. It must be available for at least 45 days. It has been posted in Spanish for those who would prefer to read it in Spanish. The final plan has to be submitted after revisions accounting for comments and feedback that we receive from the public no later than January 4th, 2021. So what we're doing tonight is a key component in making sure that this action plan fits the needs of the Virgin Islands, that meets the needs that you see, and that fits within the mitigation needs assessment risks that have been identified. Unfortunately, there are more needs than there are funding. For as much funding as there is within CDBG mitigation, I can tell you from what I have seen already that there are more needs than there are funds. And so we need to make sure that we're using these funds for the highest and best use so that the territory is more prepared for future disasters, and that takes time. So tonight is a key component of that. And again, I thank you for your time and your attention as we look at comments moving forward. Next slide. So again, within the CDBG MIT draft action plan, different activities have been allocated a percentage of the total funds. Infrastructure, economic resilience, housing, public services, planning, and administration. Those are the activities that are currently anticipated to be funded within this total mitigation allocation. We now want to hear comments and your feedback so that we can make sure that this allocation, this draft, is a good fit. And that's the purpose for this meeting tonight. So I'm going to turn the time back over to Kiva Muller, and she will facilitate the next step as we hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the public comment period ends on December 22nd. So you have now up until then to submit all of your comments. This is actually the second public hearing, my apologies there, conducted to receive citizen comments and feedback after the action plan had been published. If you have been with us throughout this mitigation journey, you would know that we did 3 public hearings before the action plan was drafted. It was June, July, and August, to get your feedback or your thoughts on how, where we should focus our mitigation dollars to draft the action plan. So here we are after it's drafted, letting you know what we came up with and if you approve of it. So the comment period is 45 days. And we have, after the comment period closes, December 22nd, we have a tight turnaround to incorporate your comments and feedback into the final action plan draft that we will be submitting to HUD for a January 4th deadline. So this is the time we have arrived at the end of the presentation, and this is the time that you are allowed to submit your comments. I'll just reiterate this slide like I did earlier. Verbal comments are encouraged. If you do, the same way with written comments in the chat feature, state your name, the organization that you do represent. And for verbal comments, you are limited to 4 minutes per person. And if you use the chat feature, I will be reading aloud your questions and someone from our team will respond. In the meantime, or if you have not, just reminding you guys to take the mitigation survey. The link is there, or you can go on our vihfa.gov website. As soon as you arrive at the website, there's a pop-up box that shows up there, and you can click the link to the survey. Also, if you are not comfortable or you need a little bit more time to review the documents and formulate your thoughts to present a comment, you can email those to mitigation@vihfa.gov. Okay, so I will start taking comments now. Checking the chat room to see if we have anything written. So the first question that I've seen here from Kiyama, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Forgive me if I'm wrong, of St. Croix. How much of the $774 million has already been allocated? And what is innovative resilient housing? How much of the money has already been allocated? And what is innovative resilient housing? I can start off answering this. None of the money has been allocated technically. What we have are proposals. So everything here is not etched in stone. It is a working draft. This is what we have proposed based on the mitigation needs assessment. We came up with dollar amounts for each of the category areas. And someone else can jump in if I did not state that 100% correctly, and then chime in on innovative resilient housing.
Hi, Kiva. This is Antoinette. You said it correct. For the allocation review on slide 41, if you bring up that slide for the public, we have allocated some funds across a portfolio of programs from infrastructure and public facility, economic revitalization, housing, also public services. So this is what Kiva is saying is we have allocated these funds in these categories. Once you move over to the next column, you're looking at potential projects and programs such as a community resilient and a public facility. It may be further defined into a specific project out of the $102 million, and that's to come in the future. So we still have a lot of financing to do as the projects do take forms and structure, but this is the first step of allocating the $774 million. When it comes to innovative resilient housing, we're talking about a housing that can, it's more than just shutters, but it's making the home safe for the occupant to shelter in place during any disaster and after the disaster, and that the environment of the home is not impacted by flooding of any sort, whether it is the riverine flooding that I spoke about earlier, or any kind of runoff, or anything that may impact the home, allowing the resident to be really resilient for the occupants in our territory. So Kiva, that is my response for that question. Let me know,
That works.
if we were able to answer his question.
Good question. I hope that works for you, Mr. Rahman. I'll move on to Mr. Richard Bourne Vanek. He would like to comment verbally. So feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to make some comments this evening. First of all, I have read the mitigation draft report and would like to express my appreciation for the obvious work and effort that went into it in terms of detail and thoroughness. However, I would wish to make some verbal comments, which I will supplement with written comments to be submitted as you indicated during the comment period. My comments, I guess, can be summarized into two general comments, which I break down. First of all, I am concerned that the proposed allocations as summarized on page 5 of the MIT allocation do not allocate sufficient percentage or dollars to economic resilience and revitalization. And I am also concerned at what appears to be, perhaps my reading, of some of the implications behind the factors to award projects in the area of resilient, critical, and natural infrastructure. In both cases, my comments focus primarily on healthcare services and healthcare facilities. As noted, it is indicated in the draft allocation report that health and medicine is a lifeline. However, as one goes through the report, it's not at all clear that it is recognized as a lifeline with sufficient significance for the allocation of these funds. For example, with respect to economic revitalization and resilience, on page 98, there's a chart which indicates programs, allocations, and associated community lifeline impact for commercial hardening and financing and small business mitigation. None of the lifelines there address healthcare services, which I find to be a significant oversight, concerning the significance of improving healthcare services. And I say that in particular because in this area, economic revitalization, it indicates that the eligible activities on page 100 include for-profit businesses. So if we're talking about economic revitalization, we should be talking about our for-profit sector and not merely our government departments, because that's where our tax base is going to be generated. That's where private sector employment is going to be generated, et cetera. I would then turn, mindful of my time limit, and I want to allow others to have all their time, so I want to be keeping that 4 minute. I have a stopwatch going. Turning to the infrastructure section, the resilient, critical, and natural infrastructure section has a very large number associated with it of $308 million. However, upon closer inspection, when I read the report 7.3.2 on page 94, with respect to healthcare, it seems to contemplate exclusively public healthcare facilities. Again, it seems that we're speaking again of our big box hospitals, our government buildings, as opposed to the significant portion of our healthcare services needs, which is addressed. And I will only say that I am encouraged that the eligible activities on page 95 in this area do include public-private partnerships. I would hope that the final review of this allocation attaches greater significance to public-private sector partnerships in which private providers can receive capital through this funding mechanism in return for negotiated commitments in a true private-public partnership to deliver services to the people of our islands, including those who have had to ship their families off island after storms, routinely going back as far as Hurricane Hugo. It never gets better. Thank you, and I will stop there.
Thank you. Anyone on the team would like to respond?
There's no really formal response for right now, other than he's making his formal comment. So
Right.
we will document it in notes.
Correct.
Yes. And I made notes for when we can come back together.
Thank you. Sharon Cauldron asked, how will you choose the actual individual projects? What is the process for that? So how will you choose the actual individual projects, and what is the process for that?
So within the action plan, we speak about several projects or potential projects, and some of the projects will come about through a request for proposal, where we be looking where we HFA may engage with a entity to provide the service, so through an RFP process. Some of the projects through this action plan will be funded through a formal application process, where people would have to, entities, nonprofits, government entities will have to actually physically apply and fill out an application for funding consideration. So it's based upon which project in particular. We have not finalized that part as yet. We will let you know as we come through the process what particular activity will have an RFP process and which activity will have a full application process.
Thank you. Brian Leonard of WAPA. You have 2 verbal questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, Brian.
Hi, yes, good night. Brian Leonard, WAPA Water Distribution. The first one is more a comment. It says that the electric grid is going to be ineligible for CDBG MIP. I just want you guys to remember that we are planning to submit water projects as well. So don't put WAPA as an ineligible entity, but just kind of have it whereas the electric grid is ineligible for tranche 3 and not the water projects. And then 2, I just have a quick question. Who dictates the project category? Do we dictate where we think our project will fall under, or do we just submit our project in the application and then you guys tell us where it's going to fall under?
So within the formal application process, we will have a section for the applicant to select which section their application will fall under, whether it is infrastructure, public facilities, economic resilience and revitalization, or a housing activity, or a public service, or it may be a planning activity.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question. Okay, so we've been using the application from tranche 2, the DR. Are you guys working on an updated application, or should I wait until you guys have a new application to submit?
So that is correct. Any activity that we're funding under MID that requires a formal application, you will wait until that application is developed, and we will come before the public and advise you on the media that the applications are on our website and available for you to download.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alexis George asks, what about the current home repair program? How is that going? And are there any future allocations for that program? And if so, how much? So Alexis George is that. Excuse me?
I will let Mr. Martin respond to that one.
Very well.
The Vision program currently has 12 projects under construction. We have another additional 12 contracts ready for execution, and we have completed 2 homes. In addition to that, we have 52 projects out to bid, and we are currently staging another 20. As far as the second allocation, Antoinette, I need you to jump in on that.
So from my take of the question is asking, will mitigation funds be used for housing repair? It is our intent that we can serve most of the unmet needs under disaster recovery for home repair, but we at HFA will be doing other home ownership type activities and much more public and affordable type activities to increase our housing capacity.
Hope that answers your question, Alexis.
I think the only question I did not answer from his initial question is how much. At this time, I do not know how much money that will be right now.
Awesome, thank you. Back to Kiyama, where do schools and educational facilities fall in these activity categories? Where do schools and educational facilities fall in these activity categories?
So when you say schools and educational facilities fall, remember mitigation funds must meet the definition of mitigation. So the activity that we fund must reduce or eliminate a long-term risk of life, injury, damage, or to loss of property, or suffering a hardship or lessening the impact of a future disaster. So the project must make the must meet a mitigation definition. When it comes to education in the schools, the DR funds through match may be able to serve some of those unmet needs from the schools or education. This is not saying that education is not allowed to apply for MID funding. It is just whatever project they bring forward must meet the definition of a mitigation project.
Alrighty. Trying to keep track of these questions in here.
Okay.
And Alexis George. What recourse can be expected for those individuals that, for whatever reason, don't qualify for the program? And is it possible for nonprofits to fill this gap through CDBG funds? So this is going back to the envision question. What recourse can be expected for those individuals that, for whatever reason, don't qualify for the program? And is it possible for nonprofits to fill this gap through CDBG funds?
So to some degree, if the applicant is not eligible for DR funding, and the nonprofit entity is able to assist them, we highly encourage and would support that. The caveat is we would not be able to give the nonprofit DR funds to assist an activity that is ineligible of receiving DR funds.
Sharon Colchin asks, should we trying to get you to mention our physical? So I guess her question is, should we mention the physical facilities projects desired in this plan itself?
I'm not too sure what she's trying to.
Sharon, if you want to unmute yourself, can you explain your question, please?
Yes, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. Yes, very well.
Thank you. I apologize for my typos there. What I was trying to ask is, should we as members of the public and as nonprofit organizations, I do represent the Coral Bay Community Council, be forwarding to you project ideas for our community that we would like to see you mention in this plan? For instance, I see community center mentioned, a multi-purpose complex at the St. Croix campus. Should we be looking, and there's another at Mars Hill Park, should we be looking to have ones that we're interested in on St. John also added to this list in this plan?
So through this comment period and this venue, through the link on the website, please feel free to expand and list the facilities and the desired projects you are interested in having us look at as it relates to St. John.
I was going to just say the very same thing. There isn't a formal process established yet for evaluation, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be commented upon as
Correct.
priorities. So by all means, take advantage of the options to put those comments in.
Okay, thank you very much.
Specific projects and any information you can give us about the projects in that comment when you're submitting it to the website.
Okay, we will do so. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Moving on, S. Edwards, disaster case manager from BIPHC. I'm not sure what that means, but I think I do know LTRG, that's a long-term recovery group. Please give examples about commercial hardening.
I only pause only in case that Mr. Griffith or Mr. Andrew would have wanted to comment, but commercial hardening is the same as maybe residential hardening, doing structural repairs in and around the facility that would make the facility resilient and much more effective for the owners or the users of the facility.
Antoinette, of course, is correct. Within the action plan itself, there is one really good example of commercial hardening. There are facilities over at Crum Bay on St. Thomas here, where there is proposed to do some commercial waterfront hardening there that would allow Crum Bay to be used as an offloading zone in time of emergency. Also, there would be some other community outreach and also some enforcement facilities located on that place that DPNR might be able to use. There are limited marine industrial sites in the Virgin Islands, and this is one that has been identified as potentially one of those. And so that's one example of commercial hardening, because the location right now does have a boat ramp, but would not lend itself to the type of activities that could be done there if mitigation funding were to be applied in that direction. Hopefully that's helpful and makes sense.
Thank you.
One of the things we mentioned residential hardening, and we also mentioned commercial hardening, but infrastructure hardening, also remember, if a road prior to the hurricane was always inundated with flood waters and was just a road, it did not have swales, culverts or drains or retaining walls, the hardening of the road would include future swales, culverts, retaining walls, anything that would allow the road to still be effective and resilient even after a hurricane or any kind of disaster. So it is making the road resilient and hardening the facility, the infrastructure, the road infrastructure, so that we all can traverse on our roads safely without any kind of impact or impediment.
Thank you. Kiama also mentioned, I hope that Aldersville Senior Center will be considered for renovation as a public facility. It has been closed for over 10 years, and seniors in Frederickson have not had the benefit of a community center. While this is not a problem while the pandemic is raging, at some point public facilities will be reopened. What about the seniors in Frederickson? So that is more so a comment. Shanika DeWint, Ms. Piggy is to piggyback off of Kiama's question, can community centers fall under this grant?
I'd just like to jump in there because this is the time we'd like you to put those type of ideas on the record so that we can have it. So nothing is off the table as long as it falls into one of the lifelines that we talked about throughout the presentation. So please present the ideas and also present them in writing to us and email it to us so that we can have it on record.
So the answer to that question is yes, community centers can fall under the grants if it's eligible under, I would think, public facilities and maybe even public services, depending on if there's any services provided through the community centers. Kiana also mentioned, back to the schools question, some schools were previously utilized as shelters. Is that not a consideration?
Mr. Griffey, you want to take that question or you want me to respond?
Sure. A lot of the schools were used as shelters, and one of the things that we're striving for in this grant is to create shelters that are not schools as well, because one of the difficulties after the storm was that schools could not go back to normalcy because they were being used as shelters. So students could not go back to school, especially in St. Croix in the complex school. So that's why we're looking to create additional shelters beyond schools, and the schools are actually being rebuilt to using FEMA funds to harden them as well, both FEMA traditional and FEMA hazard mitigation funds.
Thank you. Noel Hodge from WAPA has a comment. Feel free to unmute yourself, Noel. Noel, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Trying to get myself on mute. So I noticed in one of your slides about the hazard risk that you have like droughts and coastal flooding receiving some low marks for hazard, and I just thought that that should be revisited. Certainly, we would like to see investments into the water infrastructure in the event of droughts to provide sustainable water to our residents. And also, I think that coastal flooding is also a risk that that is evident here in the territory, and we should give consideration to the damage that could cause, as well as the risk for tsunamis. So I just wanted to make that comment, and I don't know if you care to comment on what your approach was for the risk assessment based on the matrix that you provided on that PowerPoint sheet.
Mr. Hodge, thank you for that comment. If you look into the action plan, that's one of the things we noticed based on the matrix, that drought was a low risk, but we expanded upon it for the particular things for the Virgin Islands. One of the things that you'll notice in the action plan is that we said, based on a truck of water that'll cost about $400 to say in St. John, for that same amount of water, you can pay about $40 if they're using WAPA water. So one of the things we speak about in the plan is the need to expand WAPA water lines. So thank you for making that comment, and please read the entire plan too as well, because we are in firm agreement with you that WAPA water expanding and improving on the water lines will go a long way to address the vulnerabilities of our low to moderate income individuals who only have a sister.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I skipped over a question earlier in the chat by Kiama. This is a considerably small turnout that I would have expected. What mailing lists and PR did you utilize? The St. Croix Foundation has a nonprofit consortium. I don't see any represented other than VI Partners for Healthy Communities. I think a lot more of the nonprofits would have wanted to be involved. So on the mailing list, we send it out to all media partners, senators, the executive branch, and a number of nonprofit organizations. This is the first that I'm hearing about the St. Croix Foundation's nonprofit consortium, so I'll definitely be looking into that. We do have another meeting scheduled for December 3rd, and before that, there will be a smaller webinar hosted by our Public Services and Facilities Program Manager, who will be reaching out to NGOs, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies that provide public services to the community. So we'll tap into that database as well. We've been on the radio stations each morning for the past 3 days, and we have an aggressive push on social media. So offline, if you have some other ideas of smaller demographics that I may have missed, I'm welcome to your suggestions, Kiama. Thank you for that comment. I'm moving down. Okay, Sharon also asked, how did you determine the allocation mix between the themes? For instance, 100 million for public facilities and 300 million for natural infrastructure. What created the amounts?
Only giving pause in case Andrew wanted to respond to the question, but one of the
I can do that if you would like. I
Yeah.
think between you and Mr. Griffith, your answer would be better than mine.
So I'll take a first stab of it, and then you can always chime in. So one of the reasons why you may see that natural infrastructure may be about 3 times more than public facilities is the nature and the scope of the project. Most of it is a lot of road infrastructure, which will cost much more money than a public facility, even if you're building from scratch. From doing DR initially, when we were prior to DR, I think someone was telling me it's about $1 million per mile to do some road construction, and that was before the hurricane now that we are 3 years into the hurricane and more before we actually use mitigation funding, a mile can cost us several $1,000,000. So infrastructure will always be higher construction costs as it relates to doing a public facility. And Andrew, please go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, no, I know that there's been a lot of discussion and back and forth as we've looked at different divisions, and Antoinette is correct. Some of it is simply the nature of the projects that are involved, and the benefit cost analysis that's linked back to those particular identified risks. And those percentages have changed a little bit, and they may change again depending on comments and how things ultimately play out. But it's a very good question, and it's a moving number that may be altered. So it took a lot of back and forth and a lot of calculations and analysis of data to get us there.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention that this is the second hearing. We had a good amount of participants the first time around, and I didn't anticipate that those same people would have joined this one. And aside from the presentation, we've been getting some really good comments, quality comments, I can say, and the push will not stop. Public comment period ends on December 22nd. And following these Zoom calls, we will definitely be going to radio stations to bring this information to those listeners that are on the airwaves, but not necessarily on the internet. Let's see, any more questions, guys? I think this was a good mix of questions. We're all, the chat function is going to be saved, and we will gather all of the data, all of the questions, comments, and feedback, and place it in the action plan before we submit it to HUD. So your questions will be answered, and your comments will be observed in the documents as well. I do encourage you to send your comments, even if you want to reiterate what you learned here and or asked, and your questions were answered here, into the email, so we can get a full, just a formal written response from you. So these are going to be archived as well, but I still encourage you to send your comments to mitigation@vihfa.gov email. Still entertaining questions. I think our end time is supposed to be 7:30, so we have 6 more minutes for questions. Still want to encourage you to take this survey that's on our website. Read the documents. One of the reasons the presentation is so heavy with information, and you saw some lengthy quotes or excerpts from the action plan, is because the document is really, really long. And I want to thank Richard. I know that you went through the document. I know that because you reference pages, and I know what you were talking about because I read the document. So thank you for that. But for some people that may want the synthesized version, this presentation gives you a good idea. And all of that is located on the website. So the action plan in English and Spanish, and this presentation is on the website as well. And you can always feel free to call the office, 772-4432 or 777-4432, if you have questions about anything that you read, or you can email, of course, if you need some clarification on anything that you read in the action plan or seen in the presentation. I think I have another question here. Let's see. Oh, you're welcome. I'm going to check the Facebook Live to see if there's any questions there. Dahlia, if you're still watching, this is via Facebook. Good evening. Is there any plans for home construction loans? And if yes, when can applicants apply? I think this can be answered under the new home construction program. If anybody wants to talk to that, speak to that. Sorry.
Actually, home construction loans, it's something that's part of VIHFA's everyday business. Please don't wait for the CDBG MIT action plan to come about. People can call our offices at the number Ms. Muller just gave, 340-772-4432 or 340-777-4432, and we'll help you with home construction loans right now. That's part of our everyday business, and our core job is unlocking the door to affordable housing in the territory. So call and ask for our homeownership division, and we'll be able to assist you right away.
Thank you. That's the only question on the Facebook Live. I have 3 more minutes for questions or comments. And I'm gonna go back to the timeline slide. Let me, if I can find it really quickly. Yeah, so right now we are in the action plan public comment period. Like I said, it ends on December 22nd. It's gonna be open for 45 days. And we are asking you to submit your comments and feedback, and we will respond to and incorporate the public comments in the action plan after the deadline, and then it's going to be submitted to HUD by January 4th. I'm not too sure, maybe someone else can jump in, but HUD has a deadline on which to respond back to us with the action plan, and once we get it back from them and we all sign the grant agreement, then the 12-year time clock starts. And then after that, we will come back out to the public to let you guys know if and when you can start submitting your project applications for funds and let you know how to get access to the money. I think I see some more questions. Kiyama also asked, will any of the housing include solar and green technology? Are you referring to the new home construction program? I mean, yeah, new home construction that's listed under housing?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone want to take that question? Will any of the housing include solar and green technology?
Yes, Darrell Griffith, I'll take that. Both the single family and the multifamily homes will include solar, and will include green technology. All of the multifamily homes that are being built right now, Megan's Junction as an example, is off the grid, and Dunu, which is going to be built too as well, will be almost all 100% off the grid too as well. And we include in all of our single family home construction a port for solar panels, for solar water heaters. We didn't have the budget before to actually put the solar water heaters in, but now we do. So we'll be able to do that moving forward. Thank you for that.
Well, Megan's Junction project that he mentioned is halfway done. I think it's correct to say it's halfway done. I hope so. So that will be coming online sometime early to mid next year.
And there are 2 Megan Junctions. This is the second phase, actually. So the
yes,
Megan Junction 1 is complete, and residents are living there, and Megan Junction phase 2 is under construction, and it's off the grid, as I mentioned.
Yes, thanks. So last call for questions, because we are at the 7:30 mark. Last call. I'll give it one more minute, and then we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Okay, so we're ready to wrap up. Director Griffith, would you like to give closing remarks?
Certainly. I just want to thank everyone for coming out today, and the questions were fantastic, and the comments were fantastic as well. Our next town hall meeting is Thursday, December 3rd at 6:00 p.m. So if tomorrow you wake up and you say, oh man, I wish I had asked this question, or I wish I had made this statement, you have another opportunity. Thursday, December 3rd at 6:00 p.m. We will circulate the link, and we will and I ask you to share it too as well to everyone you know and every group that you know, because the December town hall meeting will be our last town hall meeting before we compile all of the comments that we receive from the public and send it out to HUD. So it's going to be crucial that we get as many people as possible to attend. So please share it. But again, just thank you for coming out. Thank you for asking critical questions, because it will change the final product based on your input that we submit to HUD. And a lot of the allocations that you see, we're going to put out RFPs for them. So it's going to be actually for you as a nonprofit, you as a business owner, you as a community citizen to apply for those funds to use it for particular projects. In this one, we're not as prescriptive as we were in the disaster recovery, in which we outlined every single project and almost every single dollar. For this, we're going to ask you for your input. Almost 100%, for example, on the homeless initiative is going to be for an RFP. So we're going to ask for our community partners to come with plans for us to put a crucial dent in chronic homelessness, because I think with over $20 million and with the point in count time showing just under 200 homeless people in the Virgin Islands, let us be the generation that ends homelessness in the territory. So thank you for your input tonight. Thank you for your great questions, and we'll stay in touch. So please be in touch with us so that we can move the territory forward with your assistance. Have a great evening.
Mr. Griffith, I just wanted to mention that I think that we may want to consider changing the time for the last one. We've done 6 p.m. And maybe changing it to sometime during the day may yield a different audience. So still open to suggestions, because we want to make sure we capture a healthy audience and get quality questions and comments. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah, so we'll be.
Well, I'm open to it. We had last two at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll think about it. I'll talk to some other people to see if that would work. And then Kiama, if you don't mind, I will contact you about the or maybe I'll just call St. Croix Foundation to get that consortium contact list. So thank you for letting me know about that. So we will definitely be back out to the public. So monitor our social media channels, our Facebook, our website for updates on other public outreach activities that we'll be doing. Thank you again, and have a good evening, everyone.